They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove said 23 minutes before everything changed. Elena Martinez stood at the pediatric ICU security desk, fumbling her badge through the reader with hands that didn't shake, not anymore, not in public, while he watched from across the corridor with the expression of a man cataloging an inconvenience. He didn't see the surgical scars hidden beneath her long sleeves. He didn't see the way her jaw tightened when the overhead intercom crackled code blue like an old trigger. He had no idea that the woman in the rumpled scrubs, limp favoring her left leg, was the same person who'd once carried 12 soldiers 3 miles under sustained fire. She was invisible, which was exactly how Elena Martinez wanted it. Mercy General's pediatric ICU smells of antiseptic and something underneath, copper and desperation mixing with the industrial hum of ventilators. Elena had worked here 6 months, always arriving 40 minutes early, always leaving after her shift ended, always alone. The other nurses noticed things about her. The way she flinched at ambulance sirens. The way her hands moved with terrifying precision during codes, as if her muscle memory was wired into something older and deeper than civilian medicine. The way she touched the faded green beret patch sewn inside her jacket lining during breaks, fingers brushing against it like a talisman, like a prayer, like an apology she couldn't speak aloud. They didn't know what that patch meant. They didn't know who had given it to her, or why she kept it hidden against her heart like a secret that could destroy everything. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 7:44 a.m. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots as the trauma team mobilized. A silver sedan had wrapped itself around a telephone pole on Route 59, and the boy in the stretcher was 8 years old with blood in his hair and a trauma score that made the veterans on staff go quiet. Colonel Garrett. Basilar skull fracture. Subdural hematoma. Pupils blown and unresponsive. The father, Colonel David Garrett, United States Army Special Forces, green beret insignia still visible beneath the hospital visitor's jacket, stood in the hallway with his hands clenched into fists because that was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Elena assisted with intake, moving through the practiced choreography of pediatric trauma stabilization. 16-gauge peripheral 4. Fluid bolus running wide open. Core temperature 96.8. She worked without speaking, which was her way, letting her hands do what her voice couldn't. The boy's parents had been arguing about which preschool when a delivery truck ran a red light. 3 seconds. That's all it took to change a family's trajectory from ordinary to shattered. By 9:15 a.m., 20 different doctors had arrived at Connor's bedside. Neurologists in white coats that never got stained. Pediatric specialists who'd published papers and trained residents. Trauma surgeons with the confidence of people who'd operated on presidents. They examined Connor with their hands and their instruments and their decades of accumulated expertise, and they all delivered the same conclusion like pallbearers laying flowers on a grave. Vegetative state, Dr. Marcus Chen, the senior neurologist said, his voice careful and clinical. Probably permanent. No meaningful recovery possible, added Dr. Sarah Kim, pediatric neurosurgery. I'm sorry, Colonel. Consider comfort measures only, Dr. Hargrove said, the chief of neurology, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. The brain damage is catastrophic. He won't wake up. 20 voices, 20 credentials, one unified message, the boy would never open his eyes again. Would never speak. Would never know his father's face. Colonel Garrett's hands remained clenched, but Elena saw his shoulders drop like gravity had suddenly doubled, like the weight of that verdict was pressing down from above and nobody could see it but her. Elena had been studying Connor's chart during the exam, standing in the corner where she wouldn't be noticed, because being invisible was her superpower. The pupils, blown and unresponsive at intake, had shown a 3mm improvement over 4 hours. Nobody else had marked it. The intracranial pressure, while elevated, was responding to osmotic therapy with a pattern Elena recognized, not from textbooks, but from field trauma cases she'd treated in Ramadi, in situations where there were no MRI machines and no neurosurgery consults, only improvisation and pattern recognition and the kind of medicine you learned when the only alternative was a body bag. Pain is data. That's what the old medics used to say. Every symptom tells a story if you know how to read it. The room went dead silent when Dr. Hargrove noticed her examining the monitor. His face shifted the way a predator's does when it identifies something moving in tall grass. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested the answer should be no. Elena didn't look away from the pupil response chart. The right pupil is trending up. 3 millimeters at admit, now 2.8. And it suggests the brain edema is responding to diuretics. Suggests possible reversibility. Hargrove's smile arrived like winter. He was tall in the way that made people lean away, with eyes the color of wet concrete and the kind of authority that came from being right so many times that he'd stopped considering the possibility of being wrong. His reputation at Mercy General was built on one thing: pristine mortality statistics. No failed recoveries that surprised him. No patients who defied his prognoses. He was the architect of expectations, and he controlled them with the precision of a conductor managing an orchestra where every musician played exactly the notes he chose. "You've been here, what, 6 months?" His gaze moved across her like a spotlight. "And you're offering a diagnostic opinion based on a 0.3 millimeter change that you probably misread." "Not misread. Measured twice." "How many pediatric neurotrauma cases have you personally managed to recovery?" Elena met his eyes. "Not my field." "No," Hargrove agreed, turning to address the gathered surgical team as if she'd already left the room. "That's why we have 20 physicians in this hospital with the specialized training to make predictions about this child's outcome. And all 20 of us have reached the same conclusion: he won't wake up." He paused, then looked directly at her with the contemptuous smile of a man choosing to acknowledge an inconvenience just long enough to crush it. "I bet you won't last a week dealing with real medicine, Ms. Martinez," Elena said quietly. "Ms. Martinez," Hargrove repeated, making it sound like a punchline. "Welcome to pediatric ICU, where we let doctors diagnose the patients and nurses change the bedpans." The surgical team laughed, not unkindly, mostly nervous laughter from subordinates watching their boss establish his dominance. Elena stood absolutely still. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply absorbed the comment like she'd absorbed 1,000 others, each one landing on the thick scar tissue of someone who'd learned that pride was a luxury and survival required a different kind of strength. A measured breath. That's all she allowed herself. A single measured breath while her eyes remained level with his. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice steady as a surgical light. Hargrove turned away, already dismissing her from his mental landscape. But something in Elena's composure had registered wrong, because he turned back once more, his expression narrowing. "You have medical training beyond nursing certification." "Basic trauma field response," Elena answered without elaborating. "Civilian course." "Well, stick to basic," Hargrove said. "Anything more complicated than that is above your pay grade." The next words out of his mouth changed everything. As he left the room, he called back over his shoulder, "If the pupil response matters at all, we'll know in the next 72 hours. Child this young, if there's any recovery trajectory, it shows immediate. If he doesn't improve by Saturday morning, he's gone. Vegetative state. Permanent. Plan accordingly, Colonel." Saturday morning. 72 hours. Elena's hands, hanging at her sides, catalogued those numbers like ammunition. She spent the rest of her shift doing what nurses did, monitoring vitals, checking dressings, recording intake and output. But between tasks, she was reading Connor's chart with the focus of someone preparing for something, studying the medications, the dosages, the rhythm of how his body was responding. The faded unit patch inside her jacket lining felt heavier than it should, as if it knew something she was just beginning to understand. As if this small boy in a hospital bed, with a colonel for a father and 20 doctors writing him off as already dead, had somehow stepped directly into her path for a reason she couldn't afford to question. By evening, the other nurses had moved on, laughing about weekend plans and the price of coffee. Elena remained, standing at Connor's bedside in the dimmed lights of the pediatric ICU, where the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm and the heart monitor beeped its steady pulse, still beating, still fighting, still alive. She pressed her fingers to his wrist, feeling the pulse beneath the skin, and whispered something nobody heard. "Okay, kid. If you want to fight, I'll teach you how." The cafeteria smelled like industrial tomato soup and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights humming their monotonous frequency overhead. Elena stood in line, her tray nearly empty, just a salad and water, the same meal she'd eaten for 6 straight shifts. Her feet ached in a way that suggested she'd walked maybe 3 miles through these corridors, up and down the pediatric ward where Colonel Garrett still lay unresponsive in his hospital bed. 20 doctors. 20 separate consultations, all delivering the same verdict with varying degrees of clinical distance. The boy would never wake. His father, Colonel David Garrett, Green Beret, decorated, unbreakable, had finally stopped asking questions 3 days ago. He just sat now. Watched. Waited. Elena felt him before she saw him. The air pressure changed. It always did when Dr. Hargrove entered a room, the way a space shifted when a predator moved through tall grass. She didn't turn around. Kept her eyes forward, tray in both hands, shoulders squared the way they taught you at Coronado Island when you were learning that the world would test your nerves constantly. "Still here, sweetheart?" "Impressive." The voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively masculine. She turned slowly, carefully, the way you moved when your hands were full and the ground was unstable. Hargrove stood in the lunch line wearing his white coat like a crown, his silver hair catching the overhead light. His smile was the smile of a man who'd never once failed at anything that mattered to him. His smile was the smile of someone who'd built an entire career on maintaining clean statistics, and pediatric brain injuries were bad for statistics. The bump came fast. It wasn't subtle. His shoulder connected with her tray at exactly the right angle, calculated, deliberate, the kind of force you only used when you'd thought through the geometry beforehand. The salad went airborne. The water glass tumbled. But the tomato soup, that was the real weapon. It spread across the white tile floor like a crime scene, the red deepening as it pooled around his Italian leather shoes. The sound it made hitting the tile was the sound of something breaking that couldn't be fixed. The cafeteria went dead silent. Every person within 20 feet had seen it happen. The attending physicians. 3 residents. 2 nurses from the maternity ward. A custodian in the corner who'd already started moving toward the mess before Elena's brain had fully processed what had occurred. But nobody spoke. Nobody moved. That was the real power of it, not the soup, but the collective stillness. The acknowledgement that boundaries had been crossed and everyone had witnessed it. Elena stood motionless for 3 heartbeats. She didn't look down at the floor. She didn't look up at Hargrove's face. She simply held herself in place, breathing through her nose in that controlled way, the same way she'd breathed when her Humvee had taken fire outside Ramadi and the driver went silent and there were only a handful of seconds to decide if you screamed or if you acted. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the feeling of muscle memory pulling against the leash of civility. 1 tear escaped. Just 1. She felt it slide down her cheek and made no move to stop it. Instead, she maintained eye contact with Hargrove. Let him see it. Let him believe it meant what he wanted it to mean. Then she bent down and started picking up pieces of letters from the tile. "I've held together shattered bodies with less than what's in your supply closet," Elena said quietly, her voice like ice water poured into a glass. She gathered papers from her water-soaked napkins, her movements precise. Methodical. Each motion carrying weight that had nothing to do with cleaning up soup. "Your statistics don't scare me." She rose slowly, dumped the soggy mess into a trash can, and walked out of the cafeteria without another word. Behind her, she heard the sound of coffee cups being set down. She heard breathing resume. She heard Hargrove's voice crack slightly when he demanded someone clean up the floor, his tone no longer casual. No longer certain that he'd won whatever he'd just tried to prove. The next morning, Elena was standing in Connor's room when Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. He was an attending physician in his late 40s, grey threading through his dark hair, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer. She'd seen his military tattoo on the inside of his left forearm, an insignia from 75th Ranger Regiment, the letters so small you'd only notice if you knew what you were looking for. He watched her for almost a minute before speaking, observing the way she checked Connor's intracranial pressure monitor, the way her hands moved with absolute certainty even though this was just a routine vitals check. "You run through drills?" Chen asked finally. Elena didn't look up from the monitor. "What?" "That technique. The way you moved yesterday on the coding patient. Pneumothorax case. The decompression." He stepped closer, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Where'd you learn that?" Elena's jaw tightened. She could feel the question like a blade pressed against fabric, not cutting yet, but testing the weave. "Nursing school covers emergency procedures." "Nursing school," Chen repeated. He wasn't asking. He was testing the weight of the lie. "I did 3 tours as a combat medic. Operated in places where there's no backup, no attending to call, no time to second-guess yourself. That decompression you performed, the angle of entry, the way you located landmarks in half a second, the pressure you applied, that's not from a textbook. That's muscle memory operating in a vacuum." Elena finally turned to face him. Their eyes met and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or the understanding that comes when two people have walked through fire and can smell the smoke on each other. Her hands had begun to tremble, and she clasped them together tightly, the trembling becoming the kind that looked like cold rather than fear. "I need to get back to my rounds," Elena said. "Where?" Chen asked softly. "Excuse me. Where did you serve?" He wasn't pushing. Just asking. His voice was the voice of someone who understood that there were reasons people didn't talk about what they'd seen. Because whatever you did, wherever you learned that, you're too good to be working as a floor nurse hiding in the pediatric ward. Elena looked away. She looked at Connor's small face on the pillow, at the ventilator tube taped carefully at the corner of his mouth, at the monitors displaying vital signs that refused to improve no matter how many protocols you followed or how many alternative approaches you suggested. She looked at this child who was supposed to be brain-dead by now, according to 20 doctors and a department head who'd already decided his story was finished. "I have to go," she said. She walked past Chen and out of the room before he could ask anything else. But as she moved down the hallway, she heard him call out, not loudly, just enough for her to catch it, "You know I know. The question is whether anyone else figures it out before this place destroys you." That afternoon, Elena was sitting in the physician's lounge reviewing Connor's chart when Hargrove appeared in the doorway with 3 residents trailing behind him. His white coat had been changed since the cafeteria incident. His collar was crisp. He was wearing the expression of someone who decided to escalate from public humiliation to something more institutional, more systematic. More dangerous. "Ms. Martinez," he said, pulling Connor's file from the rack on the wall. "I've been reviewing your charting notes. Specifically these." He tapped a series of entries where Elena had documented alternative medication protocols, suggested adjustments to the intracranial pressure management, noted her observations about response patterns that didn't align with textbook pediatric trauma. "These notes suggest clinical decisions outside your scope of practice." Elena set down her coffee. "I charted observations. That's within scope. You charted clinical recommendations." His voice was pitched like a blade. "Suggesting medication adjustments. Proposing protocol changes. That's diagnosis, Ms. Martinez. That's practicing medicine. I suggested the doctor consider alternatives based on." "Based on what?" He cut her off. "Field protocols? Combat medicine?" He smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized he was holding something powerful and was deciding how hard to press. "Interesting thing about medical credentials. You either have them or you don't. And you, Ms. Martinez, have a nursing diploma and apparently some very specialized knowledge about operating in conditions most pediatric nurses never encounter. The three residents were watching now, waiting to see if Elena would break, if she would cry, if she would do what she was supposed to do when someone with authority pushed down hard enough. The room felt like a room in a bunker, enclosed, pressure building, nowhere to exit except forward through the threat. Elena stood slowly. She met Hargrove's eyes with the kind of calmness that came from having already lost everything once and surviving it. My charting is accurate. My observations are clinically relevant. And whether you believe it or not, this child is going to wake up. Is that so? Hargrove stepped closer. And when he doesn't, when he remains in a vegetative state just like the 47 other cases in his category that have never recovered, we're going to have a conversation about scope of practice and falsification of medical records. You understand me? Elena didn't respond. She just walked past him and the three residents, each of them parting to let her through like water around a stone. As she reached the doorway, she heard him call out behind her, "Keep that uniform pressed, Ms. Martinez. You might not be here much longer to worry about it." She didn't turn around. But in her scrub pocket, her fingers found the small object she kept there, a military challenge coin, worn smooth from 20 years of being held, turned over, gripped during moments when the world was too loud and everything was falling apart. It had a green beret insignia stamped into its surface, the same insignia that Colonel Garrett wore on his uniform. The same insignia that connected her to a war she'd thought she'd left behind in the dust of Iraq. Colonel Garrett was supposed to die. 20 doctors had made that determination. The hospital's chief of neurology had staked his reputation on it. But Elena had held together shattered bodies with less than what was in Hargrove's supply closet, had learned medicine in places where the only textbook was survival, had walked through fire and sand and loss and come out the other side still capable of healing. And Hargrove had just made a critical mistake. He'd made it personal. The monitors began their song at 2 in the morning. Elena sat in the vinyl chair beside Connor's bed, her body angled so she could watch both the boy's face and the screens above his head. The ICU hummed with the white noise of machines, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, the pumps beeped their steady cadence, the heart monitor traced its green line across black glass. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the color of exhaustion. She'd promised herself 30 minutes. Just enough to review his chart, to watch the data, to convince herself that the 20 doctors who'd written him off were wrong. The numbers had been stable all night. Heart rate steady at 84. Blood pressure holding at 98/60. Oxygen saturation climbing slowly, 67% yesterday, now 71% on the ventilator. Not recovery. Not yet. But not deterioration either. A holding pattern. A negotiation between a child's body and death. Connor's hand lay outside the blanket, small and pale, hooked to an 4-line that delivered antibiotics and nutrition through veins no thicker than thread. Elena had memorized every detail of him, the freckles across his nose, the way his fingers occasionally flexed in sleep, as if reaching for something his conscious mind had forgotten. She'd held his hand during the afternoon rounds, after Hargrove had left, after the residents had cycled through their assessments and their poor prognosis comments like a liturgy of surrender. "Come on, Connor," she whispered. "Stay with me." The heart monitor beeped. "Steady. Steady. Steady." Then it wasn't. The rhythm accelerated. 1 spike. 2. 3. The number climbing on the screen, 90 beats per minute, 100, 120. Elena's body knew before her mind caught up. She was on her feet. The beeping became a rapid-fire percussion, a warning sound that meant something was failing, something was breaking, something was about to die. 140. 160. "Call the resident," Elena said to the nursing aide who'd appeared from the hallway, drawn by the same alarm that had drawn Elena upright. "Now." The blood pressure monitor cycled automatically, tightening around Connor's arm with a pneumatic hiss. The number flashed red, 82/55. Dropping. The boy's color was already changing, his lips turning from pink to the pale gray of a child who wasn't getting enough oxygen, wasn't getting enough perfusion, wasn't getting enough of what kept life burning in a body. Elena's hands moved without permission from her conscious mind. They were steady. This was the part the Navy had trained into her muscle memory, when panic became the enemy and muscle memory became salvation. In Ramadi, when an IED had shredded the femoral artery of a 22-year-old Lance Corporal named Martinez, there had been no time for fear. There had been only the sequence, tourniquet at 2 inches above the wound, pressure dressing, saline lock, and the knowledge that 60 seconds of perfect execution meant the difference between a kid going home to his mother and a flag-folded presentation at Arlington. That kid had lived. 19 others had lived because her hands remembered what they'd been taught. Connor's pressure was now 72/40. "I need a code cart and I need it moved to Trauma Bay 4, Elena said. She was already moving, already pulling the crash cart that stayed in the ICU corridor, already running through the diagnostic tree in her mind like a surgeon running diagnostics on a helicopter in a desert. Tachycardia and hypertension together. High heart rate, low pressure, that meant shock. But why? The boy had been stable. No fever. No bleeding. No sign of sepsis. He was on a ventilator, sedated, monitored every moment of his existence, and yet something inside his chest was failing. The resident arrived, a third year named Martinez, a different Martinez, one who'd completed his pediatric rotation and moved on to critical care. His face registered panic immediately. "Pressures in the 60s, he said. "What happened?" "Deterioration event. 60 minutes ago he was stable." Elena was pulling up the ultrasound machine, the one that stayed in the ICU for these exact moments, for when the body's secrets needed to be read on a screen. "Help me get the probe. We need a surgeon. Dr. Chen is in sleep. On-call surgeon is in traffic. ETA 20 minutes. Elena's voice had dropped to the tone she used when the stakes were non-negotiable. "Connor doesn't have 20 minutes. Get me an 18-gauge spinal needle, ultrasound gel, and betadine. Right now." The resident hesitated. That hesitation was the sound of protocol colliding with reality, of a junior doctor trying to remember his chain of command when the patient on the bed was becoming a different shade of gray with each passing second. "I said now," Elena repeated. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that made people move because the alternative was bearing the weight of that stillness. The resident ran. Elena's mind had already assembled the diagnosis. Cardiac tamponade, fluid around the heart, fluid that had accumulated slowly enough to hide in the background noise of monitors, but that had reached critical mass at 2 in the morning when Connor's body could no longer compensate. The pericardium, that tough membrane surrounding the heart, had filled with fluid, blood maybe, from the accident and the internal injuries, or infection from the weeks of hospitalization. Didn't matter which. What mattered was that the fluid was squeezing the heart, preventing it from filling, preventing it from pumping, preventing it from doing the one job that meant the difference between a living child and a corpse. The ultrasound screen flickered on. Elena positioned the probe over Connor's chest, over the space where the ribs created a window into the body's interior. The image appeared, the heart, a 4-chambered pump, and surrounding it, a dark halo of fluid. Fluid that had no business being there. Fluid that was murdering the child lying on the bed. 60/38, the resident reported. His voice had cracked slightly. Fear did that to people. Made them sound younger. Made them sound like the children they still were, playing doctor with a real patient dying in front of them. Connor's oxygen saturation was dropping. 68%. The boy's lips were moving now, his body trying to breathe around the ventilator tube, trying to fight something his conscious mind couldn't understand. The monitor showed the rhythm of a heart in crisis, irregular and frantic, like it was trying to run away from itself. Elena's hands found the needle. 18 gauge. The gauge meant the diameter, thick enough to move fluid fast, thin enough to thread through the space between ribs without tearing the structures underneath. She'd practiced this procedure exactly 17 times in medical training. She'd watched it performed another 103 times. She'd done it once in Ramadi, on a translator named Hassan who'd taken shrapnel to the chest during an ambush and whose heart had stopped beating because his pericardium had filled with his own blood. Hassan had lived. Hassan had gone home to Baghdad and his wife and 3 children who would have been fatherless if a Navy corpsman hadn't known the sequence. She swabbed Connor's chest with betadine, the smell of antiseptic rising up sharp and chemical. The needle was ready. The ultrasound showed her the path, the subxiphoid approach, the needle angled toward the left shoulder, inserted below the xiphoid process, that bony point at the base of the breastbone. The image on the screen guided her hand like a surgeon's eyes on a monitor during a remote operation. "Connor," she whispered to the sedated boy. "I've got you." The needle moved forward. Steady. Precise. She felt the slight resistance as it passed through layers of tissue, ear, skin, fascia, the wall of the pericardium. And then, the hiss of air escaping. The first sign that she'd reached the fluid. The needle bevel was in the sac, and the pressure was so great that fluid wanted out like water wanted to flow downhill. 20 milliliters came free in the first syringe. Bloody fluid, reddish-brown, the color of old blood mixed with serum. 20 milliliters of liquid that had been squeezing the life out of Connor's heart. The monitor changed. The heart rate dropped from 160 to 140. The blood pressure climbed. 90/60. 95/65. The child's color was already improving, oxygen flowing through restored tissue, perfusion returning to pale skin. Another 20 milliliters. And another. 60 milliliters total, and Connor's vital signs had stabilized into something that resembled life again. The heart rhythm regular. The pressure steady. The oxygen saturation climbing back toward something survivable. Elena withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used to insert it. The resident had prepared a pressure dressing, sterile gauze, tape, the routine that followed emergency procedures. Her hands were steady. They didn't shake. They never did, not when it mattered. The shaking came later, when the crisis was over and the body understood what had almost happened. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, still pulling on a white coat, his hair showing the imprint of a pillow. He'd gotten the emergency call. The attending physician, the one who'd seen something in Elena during the morning rounds, the one whose dark eyes held the recognition of someone who'd worn a uniform and learned the difference between theory and triage. He watched Elena finish the dressing. He watched her step back. He watched Connor's vital signs, now displayed on 3 different monitors, all showing a child who was alive because of something that should have been impossible, an unauthorized procedure, a protocol violation, a nurse making a decision that belonged to a surgeon. "Tamponade," Chen said. It wasn't a question. 60 milliliters, Elena replied. Subxiphoid approach. Chen moved to the monitors. His jaw tightened as he processed what he was seeing. "You did a pericardiocentesis." The on-call was 20 minutes out. Elena was already documenting, writing the time, the vital signs, the procedure, the outcome. Writing it all down so the record would be clear and honest about what had happened and why. He wouldn't have survived 20 minutes. Chen looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he had in the surgical suite, the way that suggested he understood something about the person standing in front of him. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Experience," Elena said simply. "Necessity. The things they teach you when waiting isn't an option." Connor's heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. The 4 pumps hummed. A child who was supposed to be dead was instead breathing, alive, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of his own survival. The sun would rise in 4 hours. By then, Elena didn't know, Hargrove would have received the report. By then, he would have called the board members who owed him favors. By then, the machinery of institutional protection would have begun to turn, the same way it always did when someone overstepped, when someone performed a miracle that violated protocol, when someone saved a life in a way that the system hadn't authorized. But for now, in the darkness before dawn, Elena stood beside Connor's bed and watched a child breathe who wouldn't be breathing if she'd followed the rules. The dawn came gray and cold through the pediatric ICU windows, and Dr. Chen stood at the medication cart reviewing the pericardiocentesis documentation with the kind of focus that made other residents step back. 9 milliliters of fluid extracted. 60 total. Perfect needle placement at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The technique was textbook, no, better than textbook. Combat grade. He'd seen hands work like that once before, in a dusty field hospital outside Fallujah, belonging to a senior chief petty officer whose name he'd never learned but whose steady fingers had kept a lieutenant colonel breathing through an open pneumothorax. The vital signs after extraction told the story. O2 sat climbed from 68 to 91. Blood pressure stabilized. Cardiac rhythm steadied into sinus. A child who should have been dead was breathing on his own. Dr. Chen closed the chart and moved toward the nurse's station, already composing the words, professional gratitude, respect, and acknowledgement that he'd witnessed something extraordinary. The morning shift was changing. He could see Elena through the glass wall of Connor's room, checking me for line with a kind of methodical care that suggested she hadn't slept. He'd find her first. Congratulate her. Maybe even offer to document the procedure himself as a teaching case, protect her from whatever administrative scrutiny might come from such an unconventional save. He was halfway down the corridor when the elevator doors opened. Security. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, expressions professionally neutral. Behind them, Dr. Hargrove in his monogrammed white coat, holding a manila folder the way a prosecutor holds evidence. The chief of neurology's face carried the particular satisfaction of a man who'd spent the last 4 hours making phone calls that had borne fruit. He'd activated his network at 5:41 a.m., 3 board members who owed him favors, 2 from his golf club, 1 whose daughter he'd mentored through her pediatric fellowship. By 6:15, an external investigation was authorized. By 6:20, credential verification was already flagging Elena's references as inconsistent with her employment application. By 6:22, he'd already spoken to the Texas Board of Nursing, painting a picture of a rogue practitioner who'd performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization, without proper training documentation, without anything except audacity and luck. Luck didn't last in medicine. Hargrove knew this. Luck didn't build institutional reputations. Protocol did. Policy did. The careful documentation of how things were supposed to be done, and the swift elimination of variables that threatened that order. He didn't acknowledge Dr. Chen. Instead, he walked directly to the medication cart where Elena was just beginning to count the morning stock, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her hand steady as she moved from drawer to drawer. The silence that fell across the pediatric ICU was the kind that comes before impact, the breath held before the collision, the moment before the machinery of institutional power grinds down on something small. Elena Martinez, Hargrove announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the floor, ensuring witnesses, ensuring documentation, ensuring that this moment existed in the collective memory of the unit. You're terminated effective immediately for performing procedures outside your scope of practice and violating patient safety protocols. He extended his hand, palm up. His eyes held the cold certainty of a man who'd never been questioned by someone without institutional protection. Your badge, he said. Elena didn't look up from the medication count. She finished the line she was tallying, a small defiance, a refusal to be rushed by his timeline, and then set down her pen with the careful precision of someone placing artillery. When she looked at him, Dr. Chen saw something shift in her face, something ancient and controlled, like watching a pressure valve open just a fraction of an inch. I saved a child's life, Elena said. Quiet. 6 words. The room held them like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. You violated state nursing practice acts, Hargrove countered, his voice climbing slightly, the first sign that her calm was destabilizing him. You performed a procedure that required physician authorization. Connor's door opened behind them. Colonel Garrett emerged, still in yesterday's clothes, the kind of rumple that comes from not leaving a bedside for 18 hours. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear, and he was looking directly at Hargrove with the expression of a man who'd spent his life in situations where polite was a luxury he couldn't afford. That nurse saved my son's life last night, the colonel said. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. It had the weight of absolute certainty. His heart wasn't beating right. The machine said so. She knew what to do. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd anticipated this: grief-stricken parent, gratitude, emotional attachment to the staff member who'd given false hope. It didn't matter. Mercy General's reputation was cleaner than one child's life, and that was how the institution had to operate. That was how it survived. "Colonel, I understand your gratitude," Hargrove began, already moving past him, already reaching for Elena's badge. "But that nurse performed an unauthorized procedure that—" "I don't care about authorized," the colonel interrupted. His voice dropped into a register that made even the ventilators seem to quiet. "My son was dying. Your doctor said he'd never wake up. She woke him up. So unless you can explain to me how protocol matters more than breathing, I suggest you step back." But Hargrove didn't step back. He never stepped back. His power lay in never stepping back, in walking forward through resistance like it was just smoke. 2 security officers had moved into position now, flanking Elena, their presence a statement. This was institutional, this was authorized, this was already decided. Elena unclipped her badge slowly. The sound of the clip releasing was small, almost nothing, but Dr. Chen heard it like a gunshot. She held it for a moment, looking at the photograph they'd taken 6 months ago, the first week she'd started at Mercy General. The woman in that photo was different. Smaller. Less certain. The woman holding the badge now was the same woman who'd performed a pericardiocentesis at 2 in the morning with nothing but her hands and her instinct and combat medicine burned into her muscle memory. She placed the badge in Hargrove's hand. One measured breath. Then she looked directly at the colonel. "Your son is strong," Elena said. His heart was ready to fight. "I just helped it remember how." The colonel's throat worked. He reached for her arm as security moved to escort her past Connor's room. His grip was gentle but absolute, the grasp of a father who understood that this woman had done something beyond his reach, beyond his rank, beyond anything protocol could measure or quantify. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking on the second syllable. Elena could only nod, not trusting her voice, which was the moment Hargrove smiled, thin, vindicated, and said the thing he'd been saving, the phrase that would echo through the hospital's HR system and medical boards and state credentialing offices: "The board has been notified. You'll never work in Texas again." The words hung in the air like a diagnosis. Final. Irreversible. The kind of statement that didn't require a response. Security escorted Elena toward the elevator. She didn't look back. That was her strength. She'd learned in Ramadi that looking back was the thing that broke you. Moving forward, even when forward was out, was exile, was the dissolution of everything you'd built, was still the only choice that preserved anything resembling dignity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a requiem. Somewhere in Connor's room, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm, recording a heartbeat that shouldn't exist. A child who should have died. A nurse who should have quit. A system that should have worked but didn't. Elena drove to the cemetery in gathering rain, her hand steady on the wheel, her mind empty of everything except the mechanics of breath: in, hold, out, repeat. The rain came harder as she turned onto the access road, the kind of downpour that makes the world look underwater, and by the time she reached the grave the sky had gone the color of wet concrete. Marcus Martinez, it read. Navy SEAL. KIA Ramadi 2007. The dates were precise. The inscription sparse. The love was measured in the flowers that someone, probably Elena, kept fresh, rotating them out every week even after 4 years, even after grief had supposedly done its work. Elena knelt on the wet grass and pressed her forehead against the cool granite. Rain mixed with tears as her shoulders began to shake, not trembling, not weakness, but the kind of deep, body-racking sobs that come from places below language, below conscious thought, from the part of her that was still 8 months pregnant and watching a monitor flatline, that was still boarding a Navy transport in Ramadi with a coffin flag draped in the cargo hold, that was still learning to breathe in a world where the word husband had become past tense. "I couldn't save our son," she whispered into the granite. Her hands pressed into wet grass, fingernails catching on soil. The cord was wrapped around his neck and I was deployed and he was gone before I even got to hold him, and now I've failed someone else's. I don't know how to do this without you." Her voice broke on each word, fracturing like glass. "I thought nursing would be enough. I thought I could save people without the uniform, without the war, without any of it. But I'm still failing. I'm still the woman who arrives too late. I'm the woman who holds the bodies of the dying, and it still isn't enough. Connor should have been fine. He should have." Her hand moved to her jacket, to the small place inside the lining where the faded green Beret unit patch lived, the one Marcus had sewn there the night before his final patrol. 14 years she'd carried it. 14 years she'd been carrying fragments of the person she used to be, the senior chief, the warrior, the woman who'd held lives together in Ramadi while her own fell apart. She stayed until dark, rain soaking through her jacket, water pooling around her knees, her voice gone hoarse, her body operating on nothing but grief and muscle memory. She stayed until her hand stopped shaking and her breath came in steady inhales, which was when the survival training kicked in, the part of her that understood that weakness in the field was a liability, that grief had to be rationed, that she couldn't afford to break here, even alone, because breaking here meant she wouldn't be able to stand up and leave. The drive home was a geography of silence. The apartment was too small, too quiet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the morning that came after, and then the morning after that, each one arriving like a sentence she had to serve, each one without the structure of the hospital, without the rhythm of shifts, without the possibility of saving anyone because she wasn't allowed to try. 3 days passed like that. 3 days of applications sent to hospitals in other states, each one rejected within hours. The credential verification was already out there, already poisoning the well, already making her name synonymous with protocol violation and liability. 3 days of checking her phone, staring at the screen, understanding that she'd been erased, that Hargrove's network was vast and thorough and that burn her out had been the point all along. But that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part came on the 4th morning when her phone rang, a staffing agency she'd registered with years ago, before Mercy General, back when she'd been willing to take any shift, any hospital, any city that would have her. They needed someone in the ER at Mercy General. 1-day contract. No permanent assignment, no credentialing issues, just body in the room for 8 hours while they covered a call-out. Elena almost said no. She should have said no. But the voice on the phone said the magic words, double time, hazard pay, critical staffing shortage, and more importantly, it meant 8 hours where she could help. 8 hours where someone might need her. 8 hours where she wasn't erased. She should have known it was a trap. Or maybe she did know, and went anyway. 3 days later, the ER doors at Mercy General burst open with a stretcher carrying a gunshot wound victim, a former Iraqi insurgent now working as a translator for the State Department, bleeding out from a robbery gone wrong at a convenience store on Kirby Drive. The paramedics shouted vitals as they wheeled him past triage, GSW to the abdomen, entry wound right lower quadrant, exit wound left flank, estimated blood loss 2 liters, pressure bandaging soaked through. Elena was assisting in Trauma Bay 2 when the commotion erupted. She moved toward the bay instinctively, muscle memory taking over, her hands reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath kit before anyone asked. The patient's fevered eyes were unfocused, rolling back, his breathing shallow and fast. Then his gaze snapped sideways. Locked directly onto Elena. His voice broke through the chaos, not English, but Arabic, raw and hoarse and desperate. "The angel of Ramadi," he rasped, then louder, struggling against the oxygen mask. "The Navy woman who pulled me from the fire. Senior Chief Martinez. You're alive. You survived." His hands clawed toward her across the stretcher, tears streaming down his temples. "It's me. It's Rashid. You carried me 3 miles under fire. 3 miles. I thought you died in the airstrike. I thought," his words dissolved into coughing, into blood. Elena's hands froze midair. Her jaw clenched. Once. Twice. The trauma team turned to stare at her. The respiratory therapist, the surgical intern, the attending physician, they all looked away from the patient and toward the woman in scrubs whose badge said Martinez and whose face had gone absolutely still. Around them, the hiss and beep of monitors seemed to amplify, filling the silence like accusation. "Continue the push," Elena said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. It was a command. "Type and cross. 2 units O negative hanging. I need an ultrasound at the bedside now." She didn't explain. She didn't clarify. She simply took over the room with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having operated in sandstorm conditions under enemy fire, from having made decisions while rounds were incoming, from having held together shattered bodies with less than what any civilian hospital's supply closet contained. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, not in a hospital, but in field tents, in convoy trucks, under blackout conditions with only a headlamp and a prayer. The patient, Rashid, kept reaching for her even as sedation pulled him under. "Tell my family," he whispered. "Tell them the angel of remedy didn't forget." Then the propofol took him, and his eyes closed. But that wasn't the worst part. Colonel David Garrett had been standing in the hallway outside Connor's pediatric ICU room when the commotion started. He'd been there every morning at 4 a.m. for 9 days, watching his son's chest rise and fall, waiting for something that 20 doctors said would never come. The shouting in the ER had pulled him toward the sound. He rounded the corner just as Elena was calling for the ultrasound machine, just as the name hung in the air like a ghost. He heard it. Angel of Remedy. Senior Chief Martinez. His face went white. The colonel had spent 18 years in uniform, had stood in classified briefings where certain names carried legend status. Names that came up in stories about impossible extractions, about soldiers pulled from kill zones, about women who moved through combat zones with the kind of composure that made men twice their size feel like children. He'd heard the name once, in passing, from a fellow Green Beret at Walter Reed. Someone whispered it during a corridor conversation about Ramadi, about the airstrike that took out an entire insurgent cell except for a translator who was supposed to be dead. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. The colonel pulled up the military medical database on his phone, his hand shaking slightly as he entered credentials he hadn't used in months. The record appeared in seconds, pulled from archived Navy files. He read it once. Twice. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, the breathing of a man who had just realized he'd been living with a ghost. Bronze Star. That was noted in a single line. Then, Silver Star for Valor Under Fire, Ramadi, 2007. Then, another Silver Star, same location, different operation, same year. And then, at the bottom of the commendation section, the line that made the colonel's knees feel like they might give, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Navy Cross. The second highest decoration for naval combat personnel, given to maybe one person in 10,000. The page trembled in his hands. He stood there in the hallway, reading the service record of the woman he'd called just a nurse, the woman his institution had fired in front of his son, the woman who'd saved his son's life at 2 in the morning when the doctors had already written Connor off. The colonel's voice came out rough. "Where is she?" A nurse pointed toward Trauma Bay 2. He moved through the corridors with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission, his jaw set the way it got when he was preparing for something that required absolute control. When he reached the bay, Elena was still working, updating the trauma log, ordering the CT, her voice steady and professional and utterly devoid of the woman who had broken at Marcus's grave 3 days ago. "Elena," he said. She looked up. Her expression didn't change, but her hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "Your real name," the colonel said. Not a question. A statement. Your real service record. Why didn't you? He stopped himself, shifted his weight. Who you are. What you did in Ramadi. Elena set down the tablet. When she spoke, her voice was level. It's classified, sir. I signed an NDA. I have top secret clearance, Colonel Garrett replied. I read your file. The Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. You were a combat medic assigned to, he paused, reading her face. "You were attached to my unit. You pulled Sergeant Khalid out of the burning compound during Operation Resolute Justice. Didn't you?" The trauma bay had gone very quiet. The ultrasound tech had stopped moving. The surgical resident was pretending to chart. Everyone in the room suddenly found something else to be very interested in. But they were all listening. They were all taking in the fact that the woman they'd watched get escorted out of this hospital 3 days ago had a Navy Cross. "The records are sealed for a reason," Elena said, but there was something different in her voice now. A note that wasn't quite resignation, it was more like the sound of a weight she'd been carrying finally setting down. "Well," a voice said from the doorway, "they're not sealed anymore." A man in his early 50s stood in the entrance to the trauma bay, muscular and graying at the temples, with the kind of bearing that only comes from having commanded other warriors. He wore civilian clothes but moved like someone who'd spent the last 30 years in combat zones. His eyes found Elena in the crowd, and something in his expression shifted: recognition, respect, and something that might have been grief. "Senior Chief Martinez," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of someone speaking a name they'd thought they'd never say again. "I'm Commander Marcus Hayes. SEAL Team 3. I was rotating through Ramadi when you pulled that translator out of the fire in 2007. I watched you coordinate the extraction under suppressive fire. You moved like you were made of something harder than the rest of us." He stepped further into the bay. "Your Navy Cross citation is part of the standard briefing packet for our command now. Extraordinary heroism under fire, direct action that saved minimum for personnel, demonstrated composure under lethal enemy fire." He paused. "We use your after-action report to train our junior SEALs on medical decision-making in combat." The trauma team was staring openly now. "You trained half our unit," Commander Hayes continued, still looking at Elena. "You didn't just pull people out of kill zones. You taught us how to think when everything was burning. He stopped himself. "You're a legend, and you've been cleaning bedpans in Houston." Elena's eyes were fixed on the monitors. Her jaw was tight. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to save my son." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Colonel Garrett moved forward and put his hand on her shoulder. "You saved mine instead," he said simply. The ER doors chimed, 2 more visitors arriving. But these weren't paramedics. These were hospital administrators. The CEO, Robert Whitmore, walked with the kind of urgency that meant something had just broken. An IT director, James Walsh, a former Marine who'd served 8 years with 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, walked beside him with a tablet and the expression of someone carrying evidence that was about to end a career. "Elena Martinez," Whitmore said, not quite as a question. He was already looking at her like he'd been searching the building for her. "That's me," Elena replied. "Come with us," Walsh said, his voice tighter than steel. "Right now." "My office." "Secure location." He glanced back at the colonel. "Sir, you should come too. We found something." 20 minutes later, they were sitting in the hospital's media room, the only space that was completely soundproof, the only place designed for conversations that couldn't be overheard. Whitmore pulled up a video file on the large projection screen. It was security footage from the night Elena had performed the pericardiocentesis on Colonel Garrett. Clear, time-stamped, showing her hands moving with perfect precision, the needle going in at the second intercostal space, the hiss of fluid releasing pressure, the heart rate climbing from 48 back to 101, climbing back to something that looked like life. Dr. Hargrove tried to delete this file, Walsh said, his jaw tight. At 3:17 a.m., 3 hours after you were fired. He used his administrative credentials to attempt to secure deletion. He pulled up another file, a code log, a digital trail. Except I blocked it. I've been saving every frame of security footage from that night since the incident. And when I saw him trying to delete evidence, Walsh stopped himself, took a breath. I reported it to the State Medical Board at 4 a.m. You did what? Whitmore leaned forward. I reported the deletion attempt and the falsified documentation, Walsh repeated, his voice steady. I also sent them his correspondence with 3 fabricated references claiming the Martinez pericardiocentesis violated protocol. The evidence is solid. The procedure was textbook perfect. The documentation is fraudulent. The room went very quiet. Whitmore's face had gone the color of old paper. There's more, Walsh continued. He pulled up email threads, chains going back months, going back to before Elena had even been fired. Dr. Hargrove has been selectively pressuring families of patients with poor prognoses to withdraw care. Patients who would have been counted as deaths in his mortality statistics are instead withdrawn before coding as family-initiated withdrawal. It artificially inflates his success rates. I found 17 cases in the last 18 months. All families are now contacting hospital counsel. Colonel Garrett was reading the emails silently, his face growing harder with each line. We pulled his fabricated investigation reports, Walsh added. The one he filed against Elena, it references protocol violations that don't exist in our system. We cross-referenced every claim. None of it's real. Whitmore stood up. Sat down. Stood up again. He's tried to destroy evidence. His fabricated records. He's been manipulating mortality statistics. Robert, do you understand what that means? That's fraud. That's gross negligence. He stopped himself, grabbed the phone. Cancel Dr. Hargrove's privileges. Right now. Seal his office. Contact hospital security. And somebody call the state medical board. Tell them we've discovered additional evidence of documentation tampering. Already done, Walsh said. The board launched a formal investigation at 4:30 a.m. They're sending an investigator. They've also suspended his license pending the inquiry. The colonel was still reading the emails. When he looked up at Elena, there was something in his eyes that looked like rage, but his voice stayed level. He knew you were military. He knew it from the cafeteria incident. He deliberately fabricated your discharge to shut you up. Not just shut me up, Elena said quietly. To make sure Connor didn't get the best care possible. He wanted the boy to die. That's what mattered to him, keeping his statistics clean. Not anymore, Walsh said. He pulled up one final file, a letter from the hospital's legal counsel. Your termination is being reversed. You're being reinstated immediately with back pay and a formal apology from the institution. The board is also recommending you for a position as trauma clinical coordinator. Reporting directly to me. Not through Hargrove. Colonel Garrett extended his hand across the table. When Elena took it, his grip was firm, the grip of a warrior acknowledging another warrior. Welcome back, he said. 2 hours later, security found Dr. Hargrove arriving for his morning shift. His badge wouldn't scan. His office door was sealed with a security notice. The chief of security stood waiting in the hallway with 2 guards and a clear set of instructions: gather personal items, surrender credentials, and vacate the premises immediately. Hargrove's face went through 5 different colors in 10 seconds. This is a mistake, he said, his voice cracking. There's been some misunderstanding. I need to speak to the board, the chief of security said flatly. They don't want to hear from you. They walked him past the pediatric ICU. They walked him past Trauma Bay 2, where Elena was training a new resident on the fundamentals of emergency needle decompression. She didn't look at him. She was too busy teaching. She was too busy being exactly what she'd always been, someone who saved lives, not someone who destroyed them. When Dr. Hargrove realized she was watching him get escorted out, not with anger, but with absolute indifference, something in his face crumbled. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. That night, Elena sat in her car in the hospital parking lot. She had the back pay deposit notification on her phone, $87,000, wired directly. She had the job offer. She had her credentials restored, her record cleared, her name no longer covered in someone else's lies. She had everything except what she'd wanted most. But sitting there, Watching the rain hammer the windshield like applause, Elena realized something that took 9 days and a betrayal and a firing and a stranger shouting her name in Arabic to finally understand. She'd been hiding from her past, but her past was the only thing that could save the future. She'd served with honor. She'd earned those medals in combat. And she'd just saved a child's life using every single thing that past had taught her. Maybe that was enough to finally go home. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the best stories aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're whispered by the people you've underestimated all along. Like and comment below. Have you ever been proven wrong about someone you dismissed? What would you have done if you were Elena?